Hello, this is Mr. Taylor. This video is the second part to writing support arguments for a research paper. If you've not watched part one, please go back and watch that video first. Once you have your supporting argument statements in research, you can begin writing the paragraphs. A typical supporting argument has a minimum of three main elements. The first of those elements is a setup. Setup is a transition and statement of the supporting argument. In middle school, perhaps you call this a topic sentence, but it can be longer and more involved than just one sentence. Also, you can look to the supporting arguments that you've already written out to help guide you. Your goal is to introduce the supporting argument and lead into the evidence. The evidence is the introduction of research materials, including a signal phrase, and the research materials, which would be a quote, a summary, or a paraphrase. If you've done your research, this is fairly straightforward. You should introduce the source and perhaps the credibility for the evidence if this is the first time you've used that source. You're absolutely required to at least have a signal phrase followed by then the evidence. Next is the tie-in. The tie-in is an analysis of how the research material helps to defend the thesis, or simply answer the question, why is this research significant to the thesis for the reader? The tie-in is vitally important and is often the difference between a paper that receives low marks and one that receives high marks. This is where the writer shows critical thought, explains their reasoning, connects the evidence to the supporting arguments, and connects the supporting arguments back to the thesis. When each supporting argument lacks this part of the paragraph, the overall paper demonstrates no critical thought, a key to successfully writing a research paper. Do not assume that your reader just gets it and understands how the evidence ties back to your thesis. If it is so obvious that it needs no explanation, then you probably have a fairly weak point. We're going to take a look at two paragraphs using the example thesis statements from the previous video, and we'll break those paragraphs apart. And then we'll follow up with a few more suggestions after that. So this is the first paragraph that we'll take a look at. The thesis for this one is, though often considered a love story, Romeo and Juliet exemplifies the destructive nature of toxic masculinity through the actions of the male characters. And then the supporting argument here is Romeo demonstrates examples of toxic masculinity in his handling of adversity. And remember, we laid out the supporting arguments so that each one was looking at a character, and we're looking how all of them demonstrate some qualities of toxic masculinity. So we're going to look now at one paragraph that supports that idea about Romeo. Of course, I would need probably at least two paragraphs about Romeo in order to have that section of the paper complete. So this is just a one paragraph example. You would again follow this with another one. So the paragraph begins, toxic masculinity is found throughout Romeo and Juliet. While many of the male characters display characteristics of destructive manliness, as the lead, Romeo is one of the most notable. When faced with the tragedy of Mercutio's death, he abandons his peaceful intents and hunts Tybalt down in order to fight. All right, at this point, we have kind of the marking. If we were to put a slash here, we have the end of the setup. We've identified where the paragraph is headed. We've sort of clearly labeled the most important parts of this. It's about Romeo. It's about this idea of toxic masculinity. And we're going to now set up or introduce, the evidence. So that means we have the signal phrase. So signal phrase begins here. In his article published by Shakespeare Quarterly, Robert Applebaum explains how. Now we have the actual quote. So this is the evidence that I have researched. Romeo, for his part, seduced into thinking that he can escape the system altogether by subjugating aggression into law, has instead been transformed into a more perfect representation of the regime of masculinity and its masks. Okay, so we have the evidence. We have kind of a complicated quote. It's a little wordy. And this is where we're going to actually tie that in. We're going to explain why Applebaum's quote actually supports the not just the supporting argument, but also the thesis. And so again, here's a little slash. Now we're on to the tie-in. Notice the tie-in is fairly long in this example. that shows more analysis. There's more sort of going on here as far as connecting the quote back to the main ideas. So Applebaum describes how Romeo sees his attempt at peace as a failure, and rather than place blame on Mercutio's own choices, Romeo believes himself to be at fault for not being masculine enough and fighting Tybalt in the first place. He's then emboldened by the idea that he is carrying out the law because of the prince's decree, but he's really just using this as an excuse to go and fight. This is significant because it reveals Romeo's own belief that violence can only be met with violence. Toxic masculinity thrives on violence as a source of power rather than cunning, wisdom, or peace. And again, you see how the explanation here of why this quote is significant and the idea of connecting it back to not just Romeo, but toxic masculinity as an example within the play itself. The second example paragraph we're going to look at is slightly more complex. Not only does it use a slightly more complex thesis statement, but also its own structure is a little more developed. So the thesis says, despite being a star-crossed lover in Romeo and Juliet, Romeo's fate is not solely determined by his relationship with Juliet, but is actually dictated by his immaturity, which is the cause of his inevitable death. So supporting argument one, again, and take note of the slight difference. We're really looking at immaturity here, and what that means is that for supporting argument one, we're going to be taking a look at Romeo's adherence to the social norms of toxic masculinity only push him closer and closer to death. So instead of having this as part of our thesis, now we have this as one of our supporting points. We're really looking at one character rather than multiple characters. So the entire paper will be focused on Romeo and his immaturity. So how does that change our paragraph? Well, some of it's going to be very, very similar to what we just wrote, and other parts of it will make some edits, make some changes in order to make sure that it ties in to the ideas of this thesis and this supporting argument. So toxic masculinity is found throughout Romeo and Juliet. While many of the male characters display characteristics of destructive manliness, as the lead, Romeo is one of the most notable. His desire to avenge Mercutio's death and in so doing condemn himself is partly rooted in Romeo's immature definition of what it means to be a man. Again, now we have a little bit of a break here. This is the end of the setup. We're going to go into the evidence, but what's different is partly one we've mentioned here, we've gotten back to this idea of immaturity, but also if we're stopping right here, we're now going to have the evidence, but we're going to begin with a quote from the play. So you're going to see that there's a quote from the play that will be then connected to the quote from Applebaum, which will then both be used in the tie-in. This is slightly more complex. You're not required to only have one piece of evidence. You can have a couple pieces of evidence, but the more you add, the more you have to do in order to make sure that they all flow together and make sense. Romeo proclaims, "Thy beauty hath made me effeminate, and in my temper softened valor's steel." That's from Shakespeare, Romeo and Juliet, Act 3, Scene 1, lines 76 to 77. So in his article published by Shakespeare Quarterly, we're going to follow that directly with the quote from Applebaum. Robert Applebaum explains how Romeo, for his part, seduced into thinking that he can escape the system altogether by sublimating aggression into law, has instead been transformed into a more perfect representation of the regime of masculinity and its masks, found on page 271. So again, now we have this mark. The evidence has been provided, and we send the rest of this paragraph tying these ideas together. Applebaum describes how Romeo sees his attempt at peace as a failure, and rather than place blame on Mercutio's own choices, Romeo believes he is at fault for not being masculine enough and fighting Tybalt in the first place. He is then emboldened by the idea that he is carrying out the law because of the prince's decree. This is significant because it reveals Romeo's own belief that violence can only be met with violence. Toxic masculinity thrives on violence as a source of power rather than cunning, wisdom, peace, or self-control. These are effeminate, according to Romeo, and act as just one example of how Romeo's immature understanding of masculinity ensures his doom. So again here, notice some of the subtle changes. We mentioned self-control, the idea that these are effeminate, and connect back to maturity here. These are all things that Romeo is struggling with as far as his own emotional maturity. And so they are included in the tie-in now. And it connects that quote with Romeo's quote with Applebaum's quote. So those are two paragraph examples. Just a few more recommendations here as you go to write your own paragraphs. One of those is that you can organize your supporting paragraphs. You can organize them in other ways. This format is simple and straightforward guide for you to be successful with the minimum amount required for good writing. There are times when you may have different setups, when you may have multiple pieces of evidence in one paragraph, or where your tie-ins may look different than what was described here. Nevertheless, it is important to master the basic form of these paragraphs before you begin to experiment with a more complex organization. Also, for a research paper at the high school level, each of your supporting arguments will have multiple paragraphs. This is likely different than what you were taught in middle school. More basic types of essays, including a 5-paragraph essay, have each supporting argument as 1 paragraph long. That should not be the case in a research paper. Each supporting argument may have 2+ paragraphs based on the length of your paper. 20-page paper might spend 10 paragraphs on the first supporting argument. That also means that you need research to defend your supporting arguments from multiple sources, not just one source. So here is a graphic organizer. It's linked below this video in the description. You can use it if you'd like to. It's just to give you an idea of what not to skip. The key with the graphic organizer is to make sure you don't have any blanks. You can't leave out a setup. Just skip the evidence or have no tie-in. If you use the graphic organizer, it will help to make sure that you have the essential elements. Again, this is not the only way you can organize your paper, but it's a good format to get started. Finally, why research papers? And I'll just leave you with this as you're beginning to write your paragraphs, the overall purpose, what you really need to demonstrate to get a good grade. Students will often ask the purpose of a research paper, and while there are many, writing a research paper requires a high level of synthesis, an ability to demonstrate deep understanding of text, and the ability to articulate that understanding to someone else. It also requires students to make a claim and then defend that claim with actual evidence, not baseless assumptions, lies, or propaganda. These are all skills required to refute ignorance, and these skills can be well learned through literature. Good luck with your paper, and please reach out to me if you have any questions or would like some guidance on how to write your paper.